In April of 1981, in the quiet mountain community of Keddie, California, something happened that would fracture the illusion of safety in a place built on isolation and trust. Keddie was not a city. It was a small resort settlement tucked into the Sierra Nevada mountains. A cluster of aging wooden cabins surrounded by pine trees and narrow roads that curved along the Feather River. People came there to escape noise, to breathe clean air, to start over. It was the kind of place where doors were rarely locked. On the morning of April 12, 1981, Cabin 28 became the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved murder cases in American history. But the story does not begin with violence. It begins with a family trying to rebuild. Sue Sharp had recently moved to Keddie with her 5 children after separating from her husband. She was in her mid-30s, practical and determined, trying to create stability after a difficult period. The move to the mountains was not random. It was affordable. It was quiet. It felt safe. Cabin 28 was modest, but livable. 2 bedrooms, a small living room, sheen walls, wood-paneled interiors, typical of mountain cabins built in the 1960s. Nothing luxurious, but enough for a fresh start. Her children were adjusting. John Sharp, 15, was protective and independent. Tina Sharp, 12, was energetic and curious. Rick and Gred Younger shared a bedroom and spent most of their time outdoors. The 5th child, Sheila, was staying overnight with a friend in another cabin on the property on April 11th. That Friday night felt ordinary. John had invited a friend, 14-year-old Dana Wingate, to stay over. The boys had spent the evening hanging out, like teenagers do. Sue was home. Tina was there. The younger boys were inside. There was no visible tension, no signs of conflict. No one reported arguments. No one heard screams. Keddie went to sleep under a sky thick with mountain darkness. Sometime during the night, something changed inside. Cabin 28. What makes this case especially haunting is not only what happened, but where it happened. The cabin was not hidden miles into the forest. It was part of a small resort cluster. Other cabins stood nearby. People were sleeping within walking distance. A train line ran not far from the property, cutting through the valley at intervals during the night. And yet, what unfolded inside Cabin 28 remained contained within its walls. At least, that's what it seemed. In the early hours of April 12, the interior of the cabin became a crime scene. But the discovery would not happen until morning, shortly before 8 a.m. Sheila Sharp returned home after spending the night at a neighbor's cabin. What she walked into would permanently divide her life into before and after. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the living room was in disarray. Furniture had been shifted. Blankets lay scattered. The air felt wrong. Then she saw them. On the living room floor were 3 bodies. Her mother, Sue Sharp, her brother, John, and Dana Wingate. They had been bound. The scene was chaotic, but strangely controlled. Rope and electrical cords had been used. Tape, knives, a hammer. It was not random violence. It suggested confrontation, restraint, prolonged control. Sheila ran from the cabin, screaming for help. Neighbors rushed in. The local sheriff's office was called, but even before law enforcement arrived, the scene had already been compromised. People moved through the cabin. Someone covered one of the bodies with a blanket. The younger boys were located in the bedroom they had shared. Rick and Greg were alive. They had slept through the night. This detail would disturb investigators for decades. In the back bedroom of the small wooden cabin, 2 young boys had remained unharmed and unaware, while 3 people were killed in the living room only feet away. There were no signs of forced entry to their room, no attempt to harm them, no evidence they had witnessed the violence. How was that possible? The cabin was not large. The walls were thin. The struggle, according to forensic interpretation, had not been silent. And yet, they survived untouched. But one more detail made the morning Even more chilling, Tina Sharp was not in the cabin. At first, authorities believed she might have been staying elsewhere, like Sheila had the night before. But as hours passed, it became clear that Tina had been in the house when the attack occurred, and she was now missing. Her bed showed signs of disturbance. There were indications she had been taken. What had begun as a triple homicide was now a kidnapping. Law enforcement arrived to a scene already altered by panic and confusion. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was small, inexperienced with crimes of this magnitude. Keddie was not accustomed to murder investigations. The crime scene processing was flawed from the start. Evidence was mishandled. The cabin was not immediately sealed. Multiple people moved through the area before full documentation occurred, and this would become a pattern. From the beginning, the Keddie investigation seemed disorganized, and that disorganization would cast a long shadow over the case. Initial observations revealed signs of struggle. Blood spatter patterns indicated movement. It appeared that at least some of the victims had been alive during parts of the confrontation. There were 2 knives found at the scene, one bent from force. A hammer was also recovered. The bindings suggested control before death, but there were no clear signs of forced entry at the door, which meant one of 2 things. Either the door had been unlocked, or the killer had been let in. That possibility shifted the entire tone of the investigation. Was this random, or was it personal? As news spread through Keddie, fear settled over the resort community. Parents kept children indoors. Doors that had once remained unlocked were secured at night. Neighbors began looking at one another differently. The illusion of mountain safety had fractured overnight. But even in those early hours, one question overshadowed all others. Where was Tina? Search efforts began immediately. Volunteers combed through nearby woods. Officers followed dirt roads and riverbanks. Helicopters scanned tree lines. No trace. No footprints leading clearly away from the cabin. No witnesses reporting screams. No vehicle seen departing in the middle of the night. It was as if she had vanished into the forest. 3 murders. 1 missing child. 2 untouched survivors. And a crime scene already compromised. The brutality was undeniable, but clarity was absent. What happened inside Cavalier 28 was not a simple act of violence. It suggested planning, or at least familiarity. It suggested time, and it suggested that whoever was responsible felt confident enough to act within walking distance of other sleeping families. That confidence would prove deeply unsettling, because in a place like Keddie, strangers stood out, and yet no one saw anything. By the end of April 12, 1981, the quiet mountain air no longer felt peaceful. Cabin 28 had become something else entirely, and the mystery had only just begun. When law enforcement arrived at Cabin 28 on the morning of April 12, 1981, they were stepping into something far more complex than a simple homicide. At first glance, it appeared chaotic, almost random, but the longer investigators remained inside, the clearer it became that this was not spontaneous violence. It had structure, and it had time. The 3 bodies lay in the living room. Sue Sharp was found on the floor near the couch, partially bound. Her wrists had been tied. There were signs she had fought back. The room suggested struggle, overturned furniture, scattered bedding, movement across the floor. Nearby, John Sharp and Dana Wingate were also found bound with electrical cords and rope. The bindings were not loose or improvised. They were deliberate, investigators noted. Multiple weapons involved. 2 knives were recovered at the scene. One had been bent from force. A hammer was also located nearby. Blood patterns indicated that movement had occurred after initial injuries. At least some of the victims had been alive for part of the confrontation. This was not an instantaneous attack. It was prolonged, and that detail would disturb investigators long after the morning ended. There was another unsettling factor. There were no immediate signs of forced entry. The front door was unlocked when Sheila returned home. Windows were intact. No obvious break-in, which raised the question: did someone enter quietly during the night, or did someone inside the cabin open the door? That possibility shifted the direction of the investigation almost immediately. Because if this was not random, if the attacker had been known, then Cabin 28 was no longer just a crime scene. It was a betrayal, but the most urgent concern that morning was not the 3 confirmed deaths. It was Tina. Tina Sharp's bedroom showed signs she had been present during the night. Her blanket had been disturbed. There were indications she had been in the cabin at the time of the attack. But she was gone. Search efforts expanded quickly. Deputies combed through surrounding forest trails. Volunteers searched along the riverbanks. Helicopters flew over wooded areas in widening circles. Nothing. There were no drag marks leading clearly into the forest. No obvious vehicle tracks immediately connected to the cabin. No witnesses reported seeing a car leave during the night, and yet a 12-year-old girl had vanished. The 2 surviving boys, Rick and Greg, were interviewed carefully. They had slept in a separate bedroom during the attack. The bedroom door had been closed. They reported hearing nothing. No screams. No fighting. No footsteps. This detail would remain one of the most puzzling elements of the case. The cabin was small. Sound traveled. The struggle, based on physical evidence, had not been silent. And yet, 2 children remained asleep through it all. Investigators could not fully explain it. Some theorized exhaustion. Others suggested that the violence may have been more controlled than chaotic. But the unanswered question lingered. How does a triple homicide occur in a small wooden cabin without waking children in the next room? By midday, the investigation was already under strain. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department had limited experience handling homicide cases of this magnitude. Keddie was rural. Resources were thin. Procedures that would have been standard in larger metropolitan departments were inconsistently applied here. Crime scene contamination became an early concern. Neighbors had entered before full documentation occurred. Objects had been moved. One body had reportedly been covered with a blanket before forensic photographs were completed. In cases like this, the first hours are critical, and those hours were slipping away. The brutality of the scene suggested anger, or control, or both. Sue Sharp appeared to have been restrained first. The bindings on John and Dana indicated they had been alive during part of the event. Blood spatter analysis suggested movement across the living room floor. There were signs that at least one victim may have attempted to free themselves, but nothing suggested robbery. There were valuables still inside the cabin. Personal belongings remained untouched. This was not a burglary gone wrong. It was targeted, but targeted toward whom? Sue, Joan, Dana, or Tina. As the day progressed, investigators began canvassing neighbors. Cabin 28 was not isolated miles from civilization. Other cabins were within sight. Some neighbors reported hearing unusual sounds late that night, possibly muffled cries or what they believed to be a television left on. One neighbor recalled seeing what looked like a dim light in the cabin in the early hours of the morning. But none of these accounts provided clear direction. There were no confirmed sightings of suspicious vehicles. No strangers reported wandering the property, and in a small community like Keddie, strangers usually stood out. Unless they weren't strangers, as the sun began to set on April 12th, the case shifted from triple homicide to quadruple investigation. Authorities officially classified Tina Sharp as missing and endangered. Her disappearance changed everything. Now, the urgency was not just about solving a murder. It was about time. If she had been taken alive, every hour mattered. The surrounding forest became a grid of search patterns. Volunteers walked in lines through pine needles and brush. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no discarded evidence. It was as if whoever had left Cabin 28 had done so with confidence and familiarity. Inside the sheriff's office, early theories began forming. Was this a domestic dispute escalated beyond control? Was Dana Wingate the intended target? Was someone seeking revenge? Or had someone come to the cabin specifically for Tina? The lack of forced entry suggested access. The bindings suggested planning. The disappearance suggested a secondary motive beyond murder, but investigators were operating with limited forensic tools compared to modern standards. DNA analysis was not yet widely applied in criminal investigations. Evidence collection, particularly in rural departments, relied heavily on physical handling and documentation. Mistakes magi. 1981 would later become glaring. At the time, they were procedural blind spots. By the end of the first day, the community of Keddie felt different. Parents called children home earlier than usual. Doors that had once remained unlocked were now secured with extra caution. People looked at familiar faces and wondered if they truly knew the person behind them. 3 people were dead. A 12-year-old girl was missing, and the person or persons responsible had disappeared into the same forest that once symbolized safety. But what investigators did not yet realize was that the most damaging elements of this case were not only inside Kabing Vinki, Yoitu. They were inside the investigation itself, and those fractures would widen in the weeks to come. In the days following the murders at Cabin 28, investigators were under immense pressure. 3 people had been killed. A 12-year-old girl was missing. The crime had shattered a small community, but as detectives began interviewing neighbors and reviewing statements, patterns began to emerge, and so did inconsistencies. Cabin 28 was not isolated from other structures. One of the closest neighboring cabins was occupied by a man named Martin Smart. Smart lived there with his wife and children. He was known locally, familiar, not an outsider, and that detail mattered. According to initial reports, Smart claimed he had been asleep the entire night of the murders. He said he heard nothing unusual, no screams, no struggle, no disturbance. But others would later recall that Smart had been drinking heavily that evening. He had also reportedly been upset over personal issues in the days leading up to the crime. And then there was something else. Years later, Smart allegedly made statements to a counselor that raised serious questions. According to that counselor, Smart had implied involvement or at least knowledge of the murders. The statements were not recorded formally at the time, but they would later resurface, and they would complicate everything. Smart was not alone in drawing suspicion. Another name surfaced: John B.O. Boobid. Boobid was a friend of Smart's. He had a criminal history. He was described as unpredictable, at times volatile. Both men were questioned early in the investigation. Neither was arrested, and according to later reviews of the case, the investigation into these 2 individuals was limited, perhaps prematurely so, which raised another question. Did investigators narrow their focus too quickly, or did they avoid going deeper? One of the most disturbing elements to emerge later involved the possible destruction or loss of evidence. Reports surfaced that certain items recovered at the scene had either been mishandled or were no longer available for review. There were also suggestions that the crime scene had not been processed with the precision required for a homicide of this scale. Some witnesses later claimed that statements they had given were not fully documented. In rural departments of the early 1980s, record keeping was not digital. Paper files could be misplaced, details could fade, and oversight was minimal. But in a case like this, small gaps become enormous. Then there was Tina. For 3 years, there was no confirmed trace of her. Her disappearance hung over the case like a shadow until 1984. That year, a man collecting bottles near a rural area in Butte County, nearly 50 miles from Keddie, discovered human remains. The remains were later identified as Tina Sharp. The discovery changed the direction of the case yet again. Tina had not simply run away. She had not been hidden nearby. She had been transported miles from Cabin 28, which meant whoever was responsible had access to a vehicle and time. And that detail reinforced something investigators had suspected early on. This was not random. It required planning, or at least familiarity with the terrain. As years passed, frustration grew. Family members began speaking publicly about what they believed were failures in the original investigation. Certain evidence, including a hammer believed to be connected to the crime, was reportedly discovered years later in proximity to the cabin, suggesting that the original search may not have been as thorough as believed. In 2013, new information surfaced that reignited attention. Investigators re-examined evidence with modern forensic techniques. Tape collected at the scene was tested again. DNA analysis was attempted. But a passage of time complicates everything. Witnesses age, memories shift, suspects die. Both Martin Smart and John Boobeed passed away without being formally charged, which left investigators in a difficult position. Even if new evidence pointed in their direction, there would be no trial, no public resolution, no definitive closure. Another unsettling element emerged in later reviews of the case. There were suggestions that law enforcement may have had prior knowledge of tensions involving certain individuals connected to Cabin 28. Some reports hinted that conflicts, threats, or personal disputes may have been overlooked in the early stages of investigation. If true, that would mean the warning signs were there, and they were missed. Perhaps the most haunting question remained this: if the killers were local, if they were known, how did they act with such confidence? The binding suggested control. The movement of Tina suggested planning. The lack of force entry suggested familiarity. And yet, no arrests were made. No convictions secured. The case drifted into the category that every investigator dreads: unresolved. The people of Keddie moved forward with their lives. Cabin 28 was eventually demolished. The physical structure disappeared. But the case did not. It lingered. In interviews, in reopened files, in podcasts, decades later, and in the minds of those who grew up knowing that something terrible had happened and no one had been held accountable. There are crimes defined by brutality, and there are crimes defined by silence. The Keddie Cabin murders are both, because what happened inside Cabin 28 was violent, but what followed, the gaps, the missteps, the unresolved suspicions, may be just as disturbing. And the final part of this story is not about what we know. It is about what we still don't. More than 4 decades have passed since the night violence entered Cabin 28. The structure itself no longer stands. The cabin was demolished years after the murders, its wood removed, its walls dismantled. The physical space where 3 lives ended and 1 was taken disappeared from the landscape. But the case did not. It remained in boxers, in files, in unanswered questions, and in the memory of a small mountain town that never fully recovered its sense of safety. In the early 2000s, renewed interest in the case began to surface. Advances in forensic science offered possibilities that investigators in 1981 did not have. DNA analysis had evolved. Cold cases across the country were being reopened, and Unsolved cases solved decades later. For the families connected to Cabin 28, hope flickered again. Evidence that had been stored, including tape believed to have been used in the bindings, was re-examined. A hammer reportedly linked to the crime resurfaced during later reviews. Detectives revisited statements. Old interviews were studied with fresh eyes, and yet clarity remained just out of reach. Some investigators expressed confidence that they knew who was responsible. Others remained cautious. Officially, the case remained open, but inactive. That distinction matters. Open means not forgotten. Inactive means not moving. Over time, both primary suspects, Martin Smart and John B. Boobeed, died. Neither was formally charged. Neither stood trial. Neither faced public cross-examination of their statements, which leaves the case suspended in an uncomfortable space. Because when suspects die without resolution, the legal process ends. Even if the truth does not, there are aspects of the case that continue to disturb even seasoned investigators. The proximity of neighbors, the lack of forced entry, the controlled bindings, the transportation of Tina's remains miles away, and perhaps most haunting of all, the 2 young boys who slept through the violence. Every cold case has one element that refuses to settle. In Keddie, there are many. In later years, family members publicly questioned whether local law enforcement had handled the investigation appropriately. Some suggested that early leads were dismissed too quickly. Others believed that personal connections within the small community may have influenced decisions. Small towns have long memories and complicated loyalties. Whether those dynamics played a role in Cabin 28 remains debated, but the perception of investigative missteps has become part of the case's legacy, and perception over decades can become almost as powerful as fact. The disappearance and later discovery of Tina Sharp's remains added another layer of sorrow. She was 12 years old. Her removal from the cabin suggested something beyond impulsive violence. It suggested intention. But intention toward what? Silencing a witness. Personal fixation, an escalation of control. Without a confession or definitive forensic link, motive remains speculative. And speculation is not justice. Cabin 28 has become one of California's most discussed unsolved murder cases. It appears in documentaries, in investigative podcasts, in online forums where strangers debate theories late into the night. But discussion is not resolution. The legal status of the case remains unchanged, unsolved. There is no official conviction, no final courtroom declaration, no moment where the judge reads a sentence and closes the file. And that absence shapes the story, because crimes that are solved tend to settle into history. They become narratives with a beginning, middle, and end. Unsolved crimes do something different. They linger. They adapt to new generations. They resurface when new evidence is discovered, or when someone believes they know more than they once said. In Keddie, the forest still stands. The river still runs. Visitors still pass through the Sierra Nevada, unaware of what once happened inside a now absent wooden cabin. But for those who know the story, Cabin 28 is not just a place. It is a question mark carved into history. How does violence unfold within feet of sleeping children without waking them? How does a small community miss warning signs? How does evidence slip through procedural cracks? And perhaps most difficult of all, if investigators believe they know who did it, why was no one ever charged? These are not questions that fade easily, because the Keddie Cabin murders are not defined solely by brutality. They are defined by incompletion. There are crimes that end when a verdict is delivered, and there are crimes that continue not in active violence, but in absence. Absence of answers. Absence of accountability. Absence of certainty. Cabin 28 represents that second kind. The structure is gone. The suspects are gone. The years have passed, but the case remains. And as long as it remains unresolved, it does not belong entirely to the past. 3 people were killed in a living room in April 1981. 1 child was taken into the night. 2 children survived in the next room. And more than 40 years later, no one has been held legally responsible. That is not just a tragedy. It is an unfinished story. This was Cold Case Archive. Justice closes cases. Memory does not.